My name is Maya Carter. I am 27 years old. I teach kindergarten. I am a single mother to a 6-year-old girl named Ella, and on a freezing Thursday night in February, while my daughter and I were eating canned soup at a folding table inside a family shelter, a retired schoolteacher walked through the door, looked directly at me, and said 7 words that changed everything. She said, "Are you Ruth Carter's granddaughter, Maya?" I looked up from the soup. I said yes. She reached into her coat pocket, pulled out her phone, and showed me a photograph. It was a photograph of a white house with green shutters on Clover Hill Road in Columbus, Ohio. A house with a wraparound porch and a flower bed my grandmother had planted with her own hands. It was the house my grandmother had promised to leave me. The woman said a young couple had been living there for nearly 2 years. She said the rent was being paid directly to a property manager. She told me she had seen the name on the property management paperwork when she went to complain about noise one afternoon. The name was Robert Carter, my father. I set my spoon down very slowly. Ella was watching me across the table with her big brown eyes. I smiled at her. I told her everything was fine. Everything was not fine. If you want to know what happened next, stay with me. Because this story gets darker before it gets right. Before I tell you what my parents did, you need to understand what that house meant. Because this was never just about property. It was about a promise. And some promises are more sacred than any legal document. My grandmother's name was Ruth Elaine Carter. Everyone called her Nana Ruth. She was 79 years old, 4 feet 11 inches tall, and the kind of woman who could walk into any room and make it feel warmer without saying a single word. She had thick silver hair she wore pinned up at the back, and she always smelled like lavender and strong coffee. She was the most constant person in my life. From the day I was born until the day she died, she never once let me feel like I was not enough. The house on Clover Hill Road had been hers for 41 years. She had bought it with her late husband, my grandfather, Harold, before my father was even born. It was not a large house. 3 bedrooms, 1 bathroom downstairs, a kitchen with yellow curtains she had sewn herself, and that wide porch where she kept 2 rocking chairs and a wind chime that played soft music every time the Ohio breeze came through. She loved that porch. On summer evenings, she would sit out there until the fireflies came out, and she would call me to come sit beside her, and she would talk to me like I was the most important person who had ever lived. When I was 23, Ella had just turned 1, and her father had just left. Nana Ruth sat me down in that kitchen and took both of my hands in hers. She told me she had been thinking carefully. She told me that she had already spoken to her attorney, a man named Gerald Pierce, and that she had updated her will. She told me the house on Clover Hill Road would go to me when she passed, not to my father. Not to be divided. To me. She said she had watched the way my parents treated me my entire life, the way they leaned toward my older brother Derek like he was the family's center of gravity, and she said she wanted me to have something solid, something no one could take away. She squeezed my hands and said, "That house is your floor, Maya. When the world tries to knock you over, you will always have a floor." I cried. I told her I loved her. She told me not to make a scene and poured me more coffee. That was in the spring. By the following fall, Nana Ruth was diagnosed with an aggressive form of pancreatic cancer. She declined quickly. She was the kind of woman who refused to let illness be a performance, so she did not tell many people how bad it was, until it was very bad. I drove to Columbus every weekend I could. I sat beside her bed. I read to her from the mystery novels she loved. I brought Ella, who would climb up beside her great-grandmother and babble about things she had seen at the park. And Nana Ruth would laugh that soft laugh that sounded like tissue paper rustling. She died on a November morning, just before sunrise. I was 30 minutes away on the highway when the hospice nurse called. I did not make it in time. That is something I carry with me still. The funeral was held 4 days later. My parents organized everything. My father stood at the front of the room in a dark suit and accepted condolences with the practiced grief of a man used to being at the center of attention. My mother wept loudly into a handkerchief. Derek stood beside them with his wife, both of them wearing expressions that could be photographed for a sympathy card. I sat in the second row with Ella on my lap and felt the kind of hollow that goes all the way down to the bone. After the service, my father put his hand on my shoulder and said they would be handling the estate paperwork. He said there was no need for me to worry. He said they would keep me informed every step of the way. I believed him. That was the first mistake I would deeply regret. They say you never really know who someone is until you need them. I needed my parents. What they showed me was something I was not prepared for. And I have been a kindergarten teacher for 4 years. I have seen children behave badly. Nothing prepared me for this. 14 months after Nana Ruth died, I received an eviction notice. I had been living in a 2-bedroom apartment on Waverly Street with Ella since she was 3 years old. It was not fancy. The windows rattled in the winter and the radiator made a sound like a distant argument. But Ella had her room with the glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling, and I had a small kitchen where I graded papers at night after she fell asleep, and we had a rhythm. We had a life. The notice arrived on a Wednesday morning while I was packing Ella's lunchbox. The building had been purchased by a development company. Every tenant had 60 days to vacate. I read the letter standing at the kitchen counter, still holding a plastic bag of apple slices. I did the math immediately the way teachers do everything, quickly and in my head. First month, last month, and security deposit on anything near Ella's school would come to at least $4,000. I had $1,100 in my savings account. Child support from Ella's father had stopped arriving 6 months earlier without explanation. My teaching salary, before taxes, was $39,000 a year. After rent, utilities, groceries, and Ella's before care program, I was left with almost nothing each month. I needed help, and I had an idea of where to get it. I called my father first. He let the phone ring 4 times before picking up with the distracted tone he used when he did not want to have a real conversation. I explained the situation calmly. I told him I just needed a place to stay with Ella for a few weeks while I secured a new apartment. I told him I was not asking for money, just space, just time. He said he would talk to my mother and call me back. He did not call back. Not that day, not the next. I called my mother on the 3rd day. She picked up on the first ring, which meant she had been waiting for me to call first. That alone told me everything. She said she had spoken to my father and they had discussed it thoroughly. She said it was just not a good time. Derek and his wife, Cassandra, had been going through some difficulties, and they were staying at the house while things settled. She said there simply was not the space for 2 more people. I asked if Ella could stay with them while I sorted out the housing situation. My mother said that would not be fair to Derek's children. Derek had 2 children. They did not live at my parents' house. They lived with Derek and Cassandra in their home in a suburb 20 minutes away. The idea that Ella's presence would somehow be unfair to children who were not there was not an argument. It was an excuse wrapped in the language of family fairness. I recognized that language. I had grown up inside it. I said, "Okay, Mom." I hung up the phone and sat down on Ella's bed. She was at school. Her stuffed animals were lined up against the pillow the way she left them every morning, in a specific order she had decided on and maintained faithfully. A rabbit, then a giraffe, then a small gray elephant she called Peanut. I looked at those stuffed animals and I thought about my grandmother's voice. I thought about what she had told me in that kitchen. "Your floor, Maya. You will always have a floor." I started making calls. I called 2 friends who had no space to offer. I called a cousin who lived 3 hours away and could not take us in on such short notice. I applied online for emergency housing assistance. 1 week later, Ella and I moved into the Harvest Hope Family Shelter on Linden Avenue. We brought what fit in my car. Ella brought Peanut the elephant. The rest went into a storage unit I paid for on a credit card. People have a lot of ideas about what a family shelter looks like. I had those ideas too, before I lived inside one. The truth is both harder and simpler than anything you imagine from the outside. And somewhere inside those walls, the truth about my family was already waiting to find me. The Harvest Hope Family Shelter on Linden Avenue was a converted church annex. 3 floors, 22 rooms, a shared kitchen on the second floor, and a common area on the ground level with mismatched chairs and a television bolted to the wall. The intake worker's name was Donna. She was a large woman with reading glasses perched at the end of her nose and a voice that was professionally kind without being soft. She handed me a folder of rules, a room key, and a printed list of local resources. Our room was on the 3rd floor. 2 beds, a dresser with a sticky drawer, a window that looked out over the parking lot and a strip of gray sky. The overhead light was fluorescent and buzzed faintly when you turned it on. A thin hum that you did not notice until everything was quiet, and then could not stop noticing. Ella walked in, looked around, and announced that it was like a camping trip. I said yes, exactly like that. She chose the bed closer to the window. She lined up Peanut and her other 2 animals on the pillow. She asked me if she could watch something on my phone. I sat beside her and pulled up a cartoon about a girl who discovers she can communicate with animals, and I watched my daughter laugh at something on the screen, while my chest felt like it was folded in half. I cried in the shower that night after she fell asleep. Not loudly. The walls were thin, and I had already heard enough of other people's pain in those first hours to know that this space was not built for private grief. I ran the water warm and pressed my face into my hands and let myself have 3 minutes. Then I turned off the water and went to bed. The shelter had a routine, and I grabbed onto it like a rope. Breakfast was at 7. The common room opened at 8. Families shared the kitchen for lunches and dinners by a posted schedule. I cooked simple things: rice and beans, pasta with butter, scrambled eggs with cheese because Ella would eat those without complaint. I kept her school drop-off and pick up the same. I did not tell her teachers where we were living. I told them we were between addresses and would update the records soon. I told that to myself too. 3 weeks in, a woman named Eleanor Briggs began attending the Tuesday evening community dinners that the shelter hosted once a week for residents and local volunteers. Eleanor was in her mid-60s, a retired music teacher with white streaked hair and the posture of a woman who had spent decades reminding children to sit up straight. She volunteered for the shelter through her church. She brought casseroles and stayed to talk with families. She sat across from Ella and me one Tuesday in early March. She watched Ella carefully arrange pieces of pasta into what she informed us was a map of outer space, and Eleanor smiled the way people who have loved children for a long time smile, with their whole face. She introduced herself. I introduced myself. She asked my last name. I said Carter. Maya Carter. Something shifted behind her eyes. She looked at me steadily for a moment and then she said, "Are you from Columbus?" I said I was. She said, "Did you have family on Clover Hill Road?" Something cold moved through me then. A very specific cold. The kind that does not come from the temperature of the room, but from somewhere inside the body when it recognizes that something important is happening. I said yes. My grandmother had lived on Clover Hill Road. Eleanor Briggs set down her fork. She reached into her coat pocket for her phone. She opened her photographs. She showed me the white house with the green shutters. And she said the words that turned my entire world upside down. There is a specific kind of courage required to go look at something you are afraid to see. Not the dramatic kind, the quiet kind. The kind that makes your hands steady on a steering wheel, while your mind is screaming at you to turn around and go back. Eleanor Briggs told me everything she knew in the span of about 15 minutes. She lived 2 houses down from Nana Ruth's property on Clover Hill Road. She had known my grandmother casually for years, the way neighbors know each other when they share a street for long enough. After Nana Ruth passed, she had noticed the house sit empty for several months. Then, around the spring following my grandmother's death, a young couple had moved in. She had introduced herself. They were polite. They mentioned they were renting the property. She thought nothing of it at the time, but when she came to volunteer at Harvest Hope and saw me sitting at that table, she recognized something in my face. She said I had my grandmother's eyes, and the moment I said the name Carter and mentioned Columbus, she connected the pieces. She had seen the name on the property management contract when the management company had sent a notice to the street about a landscaping schedule for shared easements. The name listed as the property owner and authorized contact was Robert Carter. My father. Not me. Not the estate. My father. I thanked her. I drove back to the shelter. I put Ella to bed. I sat in the parking lot in my car for 45 minutes. And then I made a decision. The next Saturday morning, I asked Donna at the front desk if she knew a parent volunteer who could sit with Ella for 2 hours. I drove to Clover Hill Road alone. I had not been back since the funeral. The neighborhood looked the same. Mature oak trees lining the street. Older homes with tended yards. The familiar curve of the road before the hill. And then I came around that bend and saw it. The white house with the green shutters. Nana Ruth's porch. Nana Ruth's flower beds, though they had been replanted with something different. Something neat and impersonal. The wind chime was gone. The 2 rocking chairs were gone. There was a different doormat. It had a generic pattern of geometric shapes. I parked across the street. I sat in my car and I looked at that house for a long time. A light was on in the front room. Through the window I could see the shape of someone moving, a figure that was not anyone I knew. A stranger crossing the living room of my grandmother's house. Standing in the space where she had made me coffee and held my hands and told me that room would one day be my floor. I thought I was going to be sick. I pressed my hands flat against my thighs and I breathed slowly and I did not get sick. Instead, I took out my phone and I began to document everything. I photographed the house from multiple angles. I photographed the mailbox, which listed the address clearly. I photographed the street sign at the corner. I wrote down everything Eleanor had told me verbatim in the Notes app, with the date and time. Then I drove to the Columbus Public Records office. It was a Saturday, so the office was closed. I stood outside the door and read the hours on the sign. I wrote them down. I would be back on Monday. On the drive back to the shelter, I called the phone number for Gerald Pierce, the attorney my grandmother had told me she used to update her will. The number rang and went to voicemail. I left a calm, clear message. I stated my name. I stated my relationship to Ruth Carter. I said I had questions about the handling of her estate and that I hoped to speak with him at his earliest convenience. My voice did not shake. That surprised me. I hung up and drove back to Linden Avenue. Ella was in the common room building something with wooden blocks. She looked up when she saw me and said, "Mom, I made a castle." I sat down on the floor beside her and said, "Tell me about it." And I listened to every single word. When you go looking for the truth, there is always a moment where you have to decide how deep you are willing to go. Because the deeper you go, the more you find. And sometimes, what you find is so much worse than what you feared that it takes your breath away completely. On Monday morning, I arranged for Ella to be dropped at school by another shelter family going the same direction, a kindness that shelter life generates quietly and without fanfare, and I drove to the Franklin County Recorder's office when it opened at 8:30. I asked the clerk at the front counter if I could access property records for an address on Clover Hill Road. She directed me to a public terminal. I sat down, entered the address, and waited while the screen loaded. The property record appeared. The current listed owner of the house at 14 Clover Hill Road, Columbus, Ohio, was not the estate of Ruth Elaine Carter. It was not Maya Elaine Carter. It was a real estate holding entity called RPC Property Holdings, LLC. I searched the state business registry for RPC Property Holdings, LLC. The registered agent was listed as Robert P. Carter, my father. The LLC had been formed 9 months after Nana Ruth died. 9 months. That was enough to make me sit back in my chair and stare at the ceiling for a moment. But I kept going. I pulled the deed transfer records. The property had been transferred out of the estate of Ruth Carter into RPC Property Holdings, LLC, approximately 11 months after my grandmother's death. The document was signed by my father in his capacity as executor of her estate. Executor. I had not known my father was the executor of her estate. I had not been told that. I had been told they were handling the estate paperwork. I had not asked questions I should have asked because I was grieving and exhausted and I had trusted them. I photographed every document on the screen with my phone. Then I went home and I searched through the accordion folder I kept in my suitcase at the shelter. I found the letter Gerald Pierce had sent me after Nana Ruth died. It was a standard notification letter, the kind an estate attorney sends to heirs and interested parties. It had outlined the terms of the will. It had listed the house on Clover Hill Road as a bequest to Maya Elaine Carter. It had stated clearly that Gerald Pierce would be in touch regarding the transfer of the property. He had never followed up. No call, no second letter, no completed transfer. I had waited. I had been in grief. I had trusted that when it was processed, they would contact me. I had told myself that these things took time. That was 2 years ago. I finally reached Gerald Pierce on Monday afternoon. He was an older man, slow and careful with his words. When I explained who I was and what I was looking at in the public records, there was a pause long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then he said, "Miss Carter, I sent 3 certified letters to you about the property transfer process. All 3 were returned unclaimed." He meant they had been sent to an address. I asked him which address. He read it back to me. It was my parents' address. Not my address. Not any address I had ever given that office. My parents' address. Letters sent to me had been routed to them, gone unclaimed, and been returned. I had never seen them. I had never known they existed. He cleared his throat carefully and said, "There is something else." He told me that during the estate process, he had received a signed document indicating that I had agreed to relinquish my claim to the real property in exchange for other estate assets. He had the document in the file. My signature was on it. I asked him to send me a copy immediately, because I had never signed anything. My hands were shaking when I ended the call. Not from fear, from the full weight of what my parents had done. I want you to understand something about what happened next. I did not scream. I did not go to their house and break down the door. I did not call my mother and let her hear me cry. Because somewhere in the middle of everything, I stopped being a daughter waiting for her parents to do the right thing. And I became someone who was going to make sure they had no choice. The document Gerald Pierce emailed me was 3 pages long. It was a relinquishment form, a legal declaration that I was voluntarily surrendering my claim to the property at 14 Clover Hill Road as part of the estate settlement. It was dated 13 months before, approximately 2 months after the estate process began. The signature at the bottom was written in my name. I am a woman who has signed her name every day of her adult life, on parent permission slips, on lease agreements, on school registrations, on birthday cards, on student progress reports. I know exactly what my signature looks like. I have known it since I was 12 years old and started practicing it the way young girls do. That signature was not mine. It was close. Someone had clearly worked at it. But the loop on the Y in Carter was wrong, tighter than I make it, and the M at the start had a stiffness that mine does not. It was a careful imitation. It was not a perfect one. I printed the document at the shelter's community computer. I held it in my hands. I looked at that false signature for a long time. Then I did something my whole life had told me I was too quiet and too accommodating to do. I called a lawyer. His name was James Okafor. He was a real estate and estate litigation attorney based in Columbus, with 12 years of practice, and a website that had one review that simply said, "He is relentless." I chose him for that review specifically. I explained everything in our first phone call: the will, the promise, the LLC, the forged signature, the redirected letters, the 2 years of rental income going into my father's entity. I spoke for 31 minutes without stopping. When I finished, James was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want to see every document you have." I drove to Columbus to meet him 2 days later. I brought my accordion folder. I brought the photographs I had taken. I brought the printouts from the recorder's office. I brought Nana Ruth's original letter to me where she described her intentions, which I had kept in that folder since the day she gave it to me. James spread everything across his desk and went through it methodically. He took notes. He asked precise, careful questions. He picked up the forged relinquishment document and looked at it for a very long time. He set it down and said, "This is estate fraud, potentially forgery, possibly wire fraud if rental income was moved through electronic accounts. The LLC formation, the deed transfer, the redirected correspondence, the falsified document. This is a pattern. This is not an oversight." He told me the case had merit. Strong merit. He told me the first priority was filing to contest the estate transfer and challenge the validity of the relinquishment document. He would commission a forensic handwriting analysis to confirm the signature was not mine. He would subpoena the rental income records from the LLC. He asked me one question before I left his office. He asked if I was prepared for the possibility that other family members had known. I thought about that. I thought about Derek, my brother, the man who had been staying at my parents' house when my mother told me there was no room for Ella and me. The man who had never once, in 2 years, called to ask how Ella and I were managing. I told James I was prepared for whatever the evidence showed. What I did not tell him was that I had already spent the previous 3 nights lying awake in that shelter room, going back through every family conversation from the past 2 years and placing every evasion, every silence, and every absence exactly where it belonged. The picture that had been forming in my mind was complete, and it was devastating. James told me to wait. He said we needed the forensic report and the subpoena results before we took any action that would alert my parents to what was coming. I agreed. I followed his advice for 6 weeks. And then an invitation arrived. And I realized that waiting was exactly what I had always done. It was time to do something different. My parents' 35th wedding anniversary party was organized by my brother Derek. I received an invitation because, despite everything, I was still on the family mailing list. It was a printed card in an envelope. A Saturday evening in April at the Meridian Event Center in Columbus. Dinner and dancing. Formal dress requested. RSVP by the 15th. I stared at that card for a long time. James had called me 3 days earlier with the preliminary results from the forensic handwriting analyst. The report confirmed with a high degree of certainty that the signature on the relinquishment document was not mine. The letter formations and pressure patterns were inconsistent with my authentic signatures, taken from other verified documents. The analysis was documented, professional, and would hold up in court. He had also received the first tranche of records from the LLC subpoena. RPC Property Holdings had collected 22 months of rental income from the house on Clover Hill Road. The monthly rent was $1,800. Over 22 months, that was $39,600. While Ella and I had been in a shelter. While I had been lying awake on a metal-framed bed doing math on my phone at 2 in the morning, my parents had been depositing almost $40,000 in rent from a house that was supposed to be mine. I RSVP'd yes. James told me again to be careful. I told him I was not going to do anything that would compromise the case. I was not going to confront them legally or make accusations. I was just going to go. I was going to be seen. I was going to look my parents in the eye and let them know, without saying a single word about what I knew, that I was still standing. I bought a dress from a consignment shop on Broad Street. Navy blue, fitted, professional. I had my hair done at a salon near the shelter. The woman who did my hair told me I looked like a woman on a mission. I said, "Thank you." I walked into the Meridian Event Center on that Saturday evening at 7 o'clock. The room was full of extended family, my parents' friends, colleagues, the whole constructed social world they had built over 35 years. Centerpieces with cream roses, a band playing something soft near the back wall, round tables with white linens. I walked through the room toward the main table. My mother saw me first. Patricia Carter was standing with a group of her friends, holding a glass of white wine, laughing at something someone had just said. She turned to follow someone's gaze, and her eyes landed on me. The laugh stopped. The color left her face in a way that was almost theatrical. Fast and total, like a light being switched off behind her skin. Her hand tightened around the wine glass, and I watched the surface of the wine tremble slightly. I walked up to her. I smiled. I said, "Happy anniversary, Mom." She said my name, just my name, in a voice that was barely above a whisper. My father appeared beside her. He looked at me with an expression that moved through 3 stages in about 2 seconds. Surprise, confusion, and then something I can only describe as a very particular kind of fear. The kind that a person has not when they are afraid of what might happen, but when they are afraid because they know exactly what is already in motion. He put his hand out to shake mine. I shook it. I sat down at the table. I ate the dinner. I spoke pleasantly with relatives. I stayed for 2 hours. I said goodnight to my parents with a smile that told them absolutely nothing. But as I walked to my car in the parking lot, I took out my phone and I texted James one word: ready. There is a moment in every legal battle when the other side realizes what they are actually facing. My parents had spent 2 years believing they had covered every track, sealed every door, and silenced every witness. They had forgotten one thing. They had forgotten about me. James filed the complaint in Franklin County Common Pleas Court on a Tuesday morning, 11 days after the anniversary party. The complaint named Robert Carter and Patricia Carter as defendants. It alleged estate fraud, forgery of a legal document, conversion of property, and unjust enrichment. It sought the return of the property at 14 Clover Hill Road, the disgorgement of all rental income collected, damages, and attorney fees. The process server delivered notice to my parents the following Thursday. My father called me that afternoon. I let it go to voicemail. He called 3 more times. I did not pick up. When I finally listened to the voicemails that evening, they followed a predictable pattern. The first was measured, asking me to call him back so they could talk. The second was more tense, saying there had been a misunderstanding. The third was my mother's voice, not my father's, saying, "Please, Maya, just come and talk to us, please." I listened to all 3. I deleted all 3. I called James to tell him the contact attempts had begun. He told me not to respond to them directly and to document all attempts. I documented them. What followed over the next 11 weeks was the methodical, disciplined process of a legal case being built and fought. My side had the forensic handwriting report. My side had the subpoenaed LLC records. My side had the original will documents from Gerald Pierce's office, the letters that had been sent to my parents' address and returned unclaimed, and Eleanor Briggs as a witness who could testify to having seen the property management documentation with my father's name on it. My parents hired an attorney. He filed responses arguing that the transfer had been handled within the terms of the estate and that my relinquishment had been voluntary and properly executed. But forensic document analysis is difficult to argue against. During discovery, something else surfaced. Something I had suspected but had not been certain of until the documents arrived. My brother Derek had known. Not just known. He had participated. An email chain produced during discovery showed communication between my father and Derek, dating back to 3 weeks after Nana Ruth's funeral. In those emails, my father outlined his plan to transfer the property before the estate was finalized, noting that the window to act was narrow. Derek's responses were brief and practical. He had advised my father on forming the LLC. He had referred him to an accountant friend who helped structure the rental income. In one email, my father wrote, "Maya won't push back. She never does." I read that sentence 4 times. I am not going to tell you how it felt because I am not certain I have the right words. I will say that it answered a question I had been asking myself my entire life. Not why they did it, not how they justified it, but whether they had ever really seen me at all. They had seen me. They had calculated exactly who I was and used it against me. My brother Derek called me once during the litigation. He said it had been between him and my father and had nothing to do with his feelings toward me. He said he hoped I would understand eventually. I said, "I understand perfectly, Derek." And I hung up. 2 weeks before the scheduled court date, my parents' attorney made contact with James. They wanted to discuss a settlement. James relayed the terms. My parents were offering to transfer the deed of the property back to me. They were offering a partial payment of the rental income, roughly 60% of the total collected. They were not admitting to any wrongdoing. James told me to think carefully. I thought carefully. I called him back the next morning and told him my terms. My parents thought that offering me back what was mine was generosity. They had been operating under the assumption that I needed them to offer me something. They had not yet understood that when a person has already lost everything and survived it, an offer is no longer leverage. It is just an opening. My terms were not complicated. I told James I wanted the full deed transfer. I wanted 100% of the rental income that had been collected, every dollar over 22 months. I wanted my legal fees paid in full, and I wanted a signed acknowledgement from my father, in a legal document, stating that the relinquishment form bearing my name had not been signed by me. That last item was the one they resisted. My father's attorney pushed back hard on the acknowledgement. They argued it was unnecessary given the settlement structure. James told them it was non-negotiable. The back and forth lasted 4 days. On the 5th day, they signed. The settlement agreement was executed on a Friday afternoon in May. James called me when the paperwork cleared. He said, "Maya, the house is yours." I was sitting in the parking lot of Ella's school at pickup time. I said, "Thank you, James." I hung up. I sat in the car and I let the words settle into me. The house is yours. The deed was transferred within 10 business days. RPC Property Holdings, LLC was formally dissolved. The back rental payment arrived in my account in 2 wire transfers as structured by the agreement. The total, after James's fees, was enough to clear the credit card debt I had run up during the shelter months, replace the furniture I had sold before we moved in, set up an emergency fund for the first time in my adult life, and still have a substantial amount remaining. I did not go to the house immediately. I needed to prepare it first. The tenants had a 30-day notice period and vacated with minimal issues. They had not known who really owned the property. They were simply renters who found themselves caught in the edges of someone else's crime, and I bore them no resentment. I went for the first time alone, on a Wednesday afternoon in June, before I brought Ella. I unlocked the door. I walked through the front hallway. The house smelled like fresh paint and someone else's life. The floors were the same. The kitchen had the same yellow linoleum my grandmother had always said she would replace, but never did. I ran my hand along the counter where she used to set her coffee. I stood on the porch. The rocking chairs were gone and the wind chime was gone, but the porch was still there. Still wide enough for two people to sit side by side and watch the fireflies come out. I went back to the shelter. I told Donna, the intake worker with the reading glasses, that we would be checking out at the end of the week. She smiled the full-face smile of someone who gives that kind of news its proper weight. On Friday morning, I packed everything Ella and I owned into my car for the second time. We drove to Clover Hill Road. Ella had not been told about any of what had happened. She knew only that we were moving into a new house. She had been told it was a house that had belonged to a very important person who loved us. I parked in the driveway. She climbed out and looked up at the white house with the green shutters. She said, "Mom, it has a porch." I said yes. She walked up the porch steps and turned around with her arms out wide and said it was the best house she had ever seen in her life. I brought the boxes in. I made up her room first, the front bedroom with the window that caught the afternoon light. I put Peanut the elephant on her pillow. That night, I sat in a chair on the porch alone after Ella fell asleep. The air was warm and there were fireflies in the yard. I thought about my grandmother, about the kitchen, the coffee, her hands over mine, about what she had said. "Your floor, Maya. You will always have a floor." She had been right. It had just taken longer than either of us expected to get here. My name is Maya Carter. I am 27 years old. I am a kindergarten teacher. I am a single mother. I live in a white house on Clover Hill Road with my daughter Ella and an elephant named Peanut. My parents did not come to the house for the holidays that year. We have not spoken since the settlement documents were signed. I do not know if we ever will again. I am not waiting on that answer. I have stopped waiting for people who decided long ago that I was someone who would always wait. What I know is this. The most dangerous thing my parents ever underestimated was not the legal system. It was not the paper trail. It was not the forensic document analyst or James Okafor or Eleanor Briggs. It was the quiet woman who spent 2 years sleeping on a shelter cot and never stopped believing that she deserved better. Patience is not weakness. Silence is not surrender. Sometimes the most devastating thing you can do to someone who expects you to fall apart is to simply refuse to. If this story moved you, please subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon for more stories like this one. The next story coming your way is even more shocking than this one. Stay close.